I'm here with a terrific storyteller, a film director whose output I've enjoyed tremendously through the years. Mr. Kevin Reynolds is here. I'm gonna ask him a bunch of questions from his very beginnings, proof all the way through Rapa Nui, and then we will have a second sessions going from Waterworld to Risen in 2006.
Okay.
Okay, Kevin, I'd like to start from the very beginning and ask you about your childhood. What are some of the most fun memories you have of growing up, and were the movies a big part of your life then? And just an overall feeling of what your childhood was like, really.
Well, that's that's a pretty all-encompassing question. You know, I I was my dad was in the Air Force, so I grew up it's called an Air Force brat. I grew up on Air Force bases and all. And primarily we lived out in New Mexico in the middle of the desert on an Air Force base out there back in the 60s. And that was an interesting experience. Some people might have said it was kind of harsh, but when you're a kid and it's all you know, you just accept it. It was fine. But I started going to movies really early. I love movies. And in fact, on the base, I had a little paper route. They had a base newspaper. And if we delivered the base newspaper, you got a free pass to the movies. And on the Air Force base, they would, the way they ran it, they would only run movies for like a couple of days. You'd run a movie for like 2 or 3 days, and then the movie would change. So every week there was probably enough, there were like 3 or 4 movies, new movies every week, which is great. And it was really inexpensive. I think it was cost of admission was like 15 cents or something. Tells you how old I am. But so I went to lots of movies, and it had a really big effect on me. Unfortunately, the movies I was going to see were the movies of the 60s, which I think was just a seminal period in motion picture making. So that's kind of the pictures I grew up on, and the ones that really had a profound effect on me, like Doctor Strangelove and 2001. And I think the one that probably had the biggest effect on me was Doctor Zhivago. That really, just to tell a story that's sweeping against that big of a grand backdrop, a personal story like that really struck me. Nobody quite did that like David Lean did. So I always loved movies. I like to write. I would write poems. I'd write short stories and stuff. Even when I was a kid, I really enjoyed writing. But the notion of getting into the movie business just seemed too far-fetched. It's not like today where, like they say, the greatest thing about the digital age is anybody can make a movie. Well, back then it was extremely difficult to actually make a movie. You had to get the equipment, you had to get film, and it was a lot harder to do, and there weren't as many of them. So I think to some extent, you know, back in the 60s and even the 70s, movies were more special because they were they were rare. Today they're,
This,
if you look on Rotten Tomatoes, it's like every week there's 25 movies opening every
yeah,
week.
yeah, and it's a bunch of crap.
And most of it's crap, and
Mostly.
you can't possibly watch them all. And so what it's done is it's kind of desensitized us to movies. And so consequently, they're just not that special anymore, unfortunately. And I feel really lucky to have grown up in a time where you really look forward to going to the theater and watching a movie because that was the only way to see it. We didn't have streaming. We had 3 TV channels at home. I know in Europe, they probably only broadcast from like 9 in the morning till
Yeah,
maybe 9 at night. There's 1 or 2 channels, and that was it.
yeah,
So it's changed a lot,
yeah.
and I sound like an old geezer when I describe things like that because kids today can't relate. They didn't grow up in that, but I did. So that was my experience.
Well,
And
it's not that well, it's not that different from when I grew up because I'm 37. So back in the early 90s, mid 90s, it was still like almost like it was back in your day in the 60s. There was not that many movies. There was not the barrage of movies coming
right.
out all the time with the streaming services of now. So I remember going to the movies and feeling like it was an event, going to the cinema. and now people, I think what it's done to audiences, it has lowered their taste also in films because there's so much thrown at them, and people just
Yeah.
like movies have become disposable, I
It's
think.
content. They call it content.
Yeah.
They're not, it's not cinema, it's content.
Yeah.
And I heard something described the other day. I had this experience after I did Hatfields and McCoys, and I was hot for a nanosecond, and they wanted to get me into TV stuff. So they sent me around to meet all these different TV showrunners that were doing TV shows, and I found the experience really depressing because these people I was talking, I'll never forget this one in particular, this woman who was a showrunner on some network TV show. She was talking about her show and how they had a writing room and all this stuff, and she called her show. She said it's a one-eye show. And I said, what is a one-eyed show? And she said, well, it's a show where you can keep one eye on the TV while you got the other eye on folding the laundry. And it's like the radio in the background or something,
Yeah.
you're kind
Just
of paying attention to
yeah.
it.
It's just noise in
And
the background.
apparently somebody was talking about they did some Netflix show and the executives gave them notes where the note was, okay, just remember every 3 or 4 minutes, your characters need to tell the audience what they're doing because the audience is not really paying attention. They're doing something else. So they need to hear what's really going on. That's what it's become.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a sad state of affairs. But yeah. So what did you actually think that your life was had in store for you, like back then? Because filmmaking was really not like it was removed from your household. So
Yeah.
what did you think it the future held for you then?
You know, I thought, well, I watched everybody else around me. They get out of school, they got a degree in something, business or whatever. They went into teaching and they got married and started a family. Most of them stayed in the same town where they'd always lived. And growing up in the Air Force was hard in one respect because I moved so many times and I had to change friends all the time. And that was difficult. But what it did was it made me not afraid of change because I
Hmm.
knew, okay, I can survive. I'm going to move again. I'll survive this. But it taught me not to be afraid of change. So I was in college. I got a history degree because I loved history, loved storytelling. Can't do anything with a history degree except maybe teach or work in a
Yeah.
museum as a curator or something. So I said, okay, well, I got to make a living. So I decided to go to law school. I went to law school. I didn't like it, but I did it. I got out and I practiced for a couple of years. I was a bureaucrat and I didn't really like it. But what it did was that I was living in Austin, Texas. It gave me the opportunity because Austin was sort of the filmmaking capital of Texas at that time at the university. And because I was working, I had some money. So I could go down and take classes at night. I had money to make my own little films and stuff. So I was working in the daytime as a lawyer, and at night I was, working at the film school making movies. And after about a year of that, I realized I got to make a decision here. What do I want? And I loved making movies. I taught myself everything, how to do it. I said, okay, I'm going to take a chance. I can either spend the next 40 years of my life being a bureaucrat or as a lawyer doing stuff I'd hate, or I can take a chance and see about going back to film school. So I applied to film school. The guy that sponsored me was Ed Dmytryk. He was one of the original Hollywood 10. He was a visiting professor at UT at the time.
Okay.
He wrote me a letter of recommendation. I got into USC. I quit my job the next day and I moved to California with $3,000 in my pocket. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything. And I
That
went
was,
back to USC Film School. And
and that
I was
was,
like, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Is it going to kill me? No. If I fail, I can always come back and be a lawyer.
yeah.
So I just took a chance.
But wow, what role do you think? So did dreaming have a lot to do with? I mean, was dreaming a big part of your life? Uh,
Dreaming?
Dreaming. I mean, the potentiality of dreaming, like I'm dreaming of becoming a
Oh,
storyteller
yeah,
in film. And
sure.
what did your parents think when you decided to follow the urge? to become a filmmaker
They were really
and follow your
concerned.
dream, I don't know, to give up that, conservative way of that people have of going about their life. What did they think of you just following your dream? And what role does dreaming and did dreaming play for you then? And what role does it play now for you?
I think everybody has dreams, It's just it's all a matter of whether or not you act on those dreams. That's really what it boils down to. You imagine yourself in a situation or doing something that sounds great. Most people, I think, go, I can't do that. It's not possible. I could never attain that. It's just a matter of acting on the dream. And so that's what I did. I just took a chance. My parents were, when I told them, they were very concerned. I could tell. They never said, no, you shouldn't do this,
Mm-hmm.
but they were really concerned. And looking back on it now, if my own kid did something that crazy, I would be concerned. Because it was the chances of success were, so minute.
Yeah.
Um, but I just felt like it was something I had to try.
Nice. So given seeing as that your movies all have this kind of literacy about them, this classical literacy about them. I'm thinking about Robin Hood, I'm thinking about Tristan and Isolde, Monte Cristo. Um, I'm wondering if literature was a big part of your life, reading literature growing up, and you mentioned writing poems and stories as a kid. Did any of those ideas ever make it into any of your movies?
No, the ideas from the stories around they're, like they were simplistic. And if I read them
Mhm.
now, I'd be completely embarrassed. Kind of like, looking at my earliest films, I'm very embarrassed to look at them. But it was sort of a training ground, it was a chance to learn how to create in that way. Later on, what I learned in my writing was you draw on your life experiences, um, people that you've met, situations you've been in, places you've been to. You draw on that, and you may not reflect it literally, and say, oh, you write about absolutely that person or absolutely that place, but you take aspects of personalities, you take aspects of situations, and you combine all that. And yes, it influences, what you create. And I think any creative person, like the most important thing you can do, I think, as a creative person is simply have lived a life and gone out and had life experiences. So you've got something to draw on.
Mhm.
Um, because yeah, I think if you're really trying to create, you draw on your own life experiences.
So now you're at USC studying film. You gave up lawyering,
Mhm.
practicing law, and so what are your some of the fondest memories of your time spent there? Actually, I mean, you became something. You now were in love with something because you weren't in love with being a lawyer. Now you were in love
Right.
with something, and you must have been a good student now.
I was a good student because I did. I completely loved what I was doing. I just threw myself into it. I loved everything about it. I loved every class I took. I learned. It was such a great environment to learn in. These were people that were real masters at their craft, teaching all these different aspects, whether it was design, the way you actually see things, whether it was editing, sound, camera. These people, they really gave you an insight. But it was interesting because when I first went out there to the school to interview before I got accepted, and I met with the chairman, Mort Zarkov. And as soon as I met him, I started arguing because they had this sort of set agenda that you had to go through as
Hmm.
part of the courses. You had to
Okay.
take this course first, and you took this course and this course. And I felt like I'd had enough experience making my own films at UT that I could have skipped the first class or two. So I was trying to tell Martin Zorkoff, look, I've already done this. I already know how to shoot 16 millimeter. I've already edited my own movies. I should be able to skip this beginning 8 millimeter stage and stuff. And he just stopped me and he said, listen, he said, we'll teach you how to make movies. Okay. He said, we want people who have something to say. He said,
Hmm.
that's what we're looking for. We can teach you the technical side. He said, we want people who have something to say. And I really that's always stuck with me, that was they were just trying to find people from all different walks of life who, as I said, had life experiences. And they were going to teach
Something
them
to
the
say.
skill. They were going to teach you the skill of how to make a movie, but only you could bring those life experiences and create something that's unique to your personality.
Yeah.
And that's always stuck with me, that was their attitude, and I really appreciate that attitude.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, but USC was great. I was there for 2 years. I probably spent 18 hours a day there. Uh, and it was fantastic. It's changed a lot. The facility I was in had been there for like 100 years, and they tore it down and built a new
Oh.
facility, which is much more extravagant. But the one I was in was very simple. And they had an editing room there with all these old upright moviolas and a few flatbeds and stuff, which nobody knows about now. This was actual film. But the walls in the room there, people throughout the year would write graffiti on the walls all year, on the walls in the editing room. And it was open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And you could go in there anytime, any day, and there would always be somebody in there editing. You could go in there at 3 a.m. on Christmas Day and someone would be in there working. And that's what it was like. And people would write things on the walls related to the projects that somebody was on. It was a lot of humor and drawings and stuff like that. And at the end of each school year, they came in and completely painted the walls over. So you had to start over again from scratch. And then it was next year's graffiti. It was a really exciting place to work.
To be.
And I don't know what it's like now. I hope it's as great as it
Vital.
was when I was there.
Yeah. Ever thought of like teaching or something? No?
You know, sometimes I don't know. I don't know who would want me to teach, but yeah, sometimes you feel like, oh, I could share some things with some young people that are coming up, but obviously I've never acted on it.
Exactly. By the end of your time there, you had to produce a film short, and you came up with what became Proof, your short film out of
Right.
USC. But what sparked the idea for Proof? I mean, why that? Why not, anything else? Why that idea of the parachute jumping and the skydiving and all
I
that?
still I still remember where the idea for Proof came from. I was actually sitting on the couch in my crappy little apartment in Studio City one night. And I knew ultimately I wanted to do the senior level film, the graduate level film, which we call a 480. And I was trying to think of an idea for it. And like I said, I was thinking back because, a few years before when I was living in Austin, I'd always wanted a parachute. So I went up to this parachute center and I actually took lessons and I parachuted. And I probably made like 12, 15 jumps before one jump kind of was too scary and I stopped. I had a little accident that could have gone really badly, so I stopped. But I took that experience and again some personalities of people that I had known, and suddenly I started getting this idea for these guys that go out to a parachute school and take one of their friends and make him go through the lesson and what could happen. And that's where it came from. And like I said, I was only there 2 years, and they did let me skip one of the beginning courses. And then to do the senior film, which is called a 480, you were supposed to have worked on what was called a 380, the one below that in some capacity, but before you could direct a 580. Anyway, I negotiated with them. I gave them the script that was proof, and they let me do it. One of the great things about USC that you were constantly fighting with other students because they would only do so many pictures per semester, films.
Okay.
They had resources to make so many films. So you had to compete with other students to get the right to do one of those films. To either you would submit a script to get the right to direct, or to be the editor on it, or to be the cinematographer, or whatever. And you had to fight to get chosen to do these things. And it was really frustrating at the time because it was kind of disorganized, and you had to you were vying with other students. Well, what I finally realized is the reason they taught you how to do that was that's how the studio system works.
Mm.
You have to fight with other people to get approved by the studio to make a picture. And that's what they were teaching you
They were
was
preparing.
how to work the
Yeah.
system. So like what I finally realized when they approved me and I got the right to make my 580, we just learned all these tricks. So like they had this big stock room on campus there with cameras and lights and gear and stuff. And you had to reserve it every weekend to go out and shoot your films. Everybody had to go reserve equipment in the stock room. Well, you were constantly fighting for equipment because somebody else would have something reserved. You couldn't get your
Yeah.
equipment. So what I realized was for my cinematographer, I hired the guy that ran the stock room. So I got whatever I wanted. And
Yeah,
it's
you went
just
straight to the source. You went.
you just learn things like that. You learn, okay, this is what I have to do to, you know, make my film work. And
Yeah.
they would forbid, you know, we were doing flying, we were doing some dangerous stuff on the film. And our advisor specifically forbade us to spend money, extra money, and to do some things and stuff. Well, we did it anyway. And I'm not condoning it, you know, because we were very lucky that nobody got hurt or killed in some of the stuff that we did. But again, it's just you learned how to work the system to get your movie made.
Yeah.
Um, and it was an exhilarating experience. It was a really exhilarating experience.
Yeah, I've seen it on YouTube. It's on YouTube, and it's just this energy to prove.
Well,
You can tell it's it's there. It's happening before in camera. I mean, that's just crazy. You can feel it.
yeah, it was fun. It
Yeah.
was hard, but it was fun.
So, your working relationship with Kevin Costner actually began on Proof in a way, right?
It
Because
did.
you guys first met on Proof, but
Mhm.
what happened there?
Well, I was casting the film, and at that time, actors, you know, new up and coming actors, people that wanted to be in film, they wanted experience too, working in front of a camera. And so they realized, oh, these guys at USC are making films. I'm going to go and I'm going to try to get in a student film so I can get some experience acting in front of a camera. Well, at that time, Kevin was, I believe he was a stage manager at Raleigh Studios in
So
Hollywood or
are
something.
we're talking late 70s, 1979, 80?
Yeah, yeah. And he was a stage manager, sweeping floors. And he came in and he read for the lead part in, well, one of the lead parts in Proof. I liked him. I thought he was really good, but I ended up giving the part to another person, another actor. Um, and you know the story. A couple of years later, when you know I was making Fandango, um, casting that, and the casting director brought him in, and we immediately remembered each other. And um, you know, we sat down and sort of reminisced a little bit, and he sat down and started to read the character for me, and like literally within the first couple of lines out of his mouth, I realized he is this character,
Yeah.
and that was the beginning of it.
Yeah. So, Proof gets you noticed by Steven Spielberg and his newly born production company, Amblin.
Yep, yep,
Um, because basically what happened was Spielberg saw Proof and wanted you to turn it into a feature, right?
yeah.
But the way you came to it, I mean, it's just out of a movie itself, right? In and of itself.
That was very difficult because that was sort of, you know, he was going to make it possible for me to make a feature film based on my student film, but he wanted that incorporated in it. So it was like writing a movie backwards
Yeah.
because I knew, okay, I've got to write a whole movie around this sequence somehow. And I was like, where do I put it in? And at that time, again, in the course of your career, you're sort of a different person at different points, and what's interesting to you changes. And when I wrote Proof, I just wanted to do something that was kind of wacky and crazy and could show what I could do filmically and all with a student film. But by the time I sat down to write Fandango, I was kind of in a more
Soulful mood.
thoughtful, pensive mood and sort of reflected more on a period in my life and other people's lives and it came out the way it did, and so the parachute school sequence is sort of a climax for this conflict going on between the characters.
Yeah.
And that's what it became. And I think Steven, look, I will always be grateful to Spielberg for giving me my first shot at a film, but he expected something different. He wanted something that was more like Animal House because that's kind of what Proof was. And
And Fandango just isn't that. I mean,
it's not
it
Animal House.
it's soulful, it's pensive, as you were saying, it's thoughtful, it's a lot of things that Animal House isn't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Good or bad, it is.
yeah,
It's a
well,
lot of things that Animal House isn't. So anyway, I was just trying to respond to what affected me at the time and what was interesting to me at the time. And to me, that's how you create. You just respond to whatever the muse is in you and you create that. You listen to that and let that come out. And that's what I did. So that's where Fandango came from.
yeah. What was the relationship during filming between you and Amblin or Kathy Kennedy or the studio? I mean, Spielberg and his team. Were they giving you any tips or advice or saying,
Not really during shooting. No, they pretty much left me alone
okay,
to
but
their credit.
in post, there was
In
that.
post, Steven had some ideas he wanted me to incorporate, and some I did, and some I didn't.
Okay.
Um, but they, to their credit, they kind of left me alone. And I'll never forget, before I took off to go make Proof, I was at Amblin before I was going to leave for location in Texas to go shoot it, and I went in the night before I left and to Steven, and I was talking to him, and I said, "Do you have any advice on the filmmaker who's about to go off and make his first movie?" And he just sat there for a second and he said, just survive it. That was his only advice.
Yeah, that was gonna come in handy for your next projects as well.
Yeah.
Uh, did you have you and Steven ever talked about Fandango in the years later in this did you ever have
Not
the chance
really.
to bring it up or like the experience or anything?
No, no.
No.
I really talked to him about it after the fact.
Okay.
It might be interesting to do that today.
Yeah,
You know, the
exactly.
person who was incredibly supportive in post, the studio, Warner Brothers, they didn't see any upside to the movie. They were just going to dump it basically. And in post, in terms of finishing the movie, that we got the worst mixers and stuff like that. And it was really depressing. But the guy who stepped in and really made the movie, gave the movie what it needed to be completed was Frank Marshall at Amblin. Frank was great. He came in and he got us a new mix, and he got us the facility we needed to really uh, finish the movie properly. He
Properly.
got us the music rights. They didn't want to give us they didn't want to buy the music rights to some of those Pat Metheny songs and stuff like that. And Frank saw that it happened, and it made a difference in how the movie turned out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So to me, all credit goes to Frank Marshall for,
Make it happen.
helping make Fandango what it ended up being.
So you were mentioning music. How important is music in Fandango? And of course, it's very important, but I want to hear from you. And all of your projects that you've done, the music is a character. I mean, it's just very peculiar, memorable. I'm thinking Prince of Thieves. I'm thinking The Beast, Mark Isham. I'm thinking all of your projects, Monte Cristo, everything. So what did you were you the one who picked Alan Silvestri for the score, or how did
Yeah,
Alan come into the picture? And what was your vision for the score and for the songs?
I had selected the songs
Yeah.
um, call them needle drops, the existing pieces of music. I had selected those ahead of time. I knew that I wanted those in the movie. And in fact, it's one of my favorite ways to work is to, the music ahead of time. Because to me, if you pick the right piece of music, it will drive a scene. And so I was designing scenes around the pieces of music. And if you took that music out and put something else in, the scene would have a completely different tone or
Yeah.
feel. So I had already pre-selected and I shot and edited the movie to those pieces of music, like the dance at the end of Fandango and
Yeah.
all. That's all designed around that Pat Metheny piece. And what I needed though, what the picture needed was it needed some connective tissue musically to connect the scenes together, to fill in the gaps between those existing pieces. And that's really what Alan did. Alan Silvestri came in and he sort of wrote the webbing that connected all the scenes together musically, aside from those existing pieces like the Cream, and Elton
Yeah.
John
Elton
and all
John.
that other stuff. That's what he did. But I mean, honestly, that's really how I like to work. I've done films that were, all composed. Um, there are no needle drops in them. They're all composed. Like Mark Isham did a fantastic job on The Beast.
The Beast. Yeah.
Uh, and of course, Robin Hood and the others. But my favorite way to work is to actually know the pieces of music I want ahead of time and design scenes with music in mind. Because this just, to me, is a more powerful way to work.
Yeah. It just conjures scenes up in your mind, the music, right? This particular
Right.
song can conjure up a whole dynamic in your mind visually. Yeah.
I think my favorite film to do that on was actually 187.
Yeah.
And I worked with a music supervisor. He's a DJ on a famous radio station in Los Angeles called KCRW. His name's Kris Doritas. And I
Mhm.
loved Chris's music, the music that he selected and played. So I asked him to come on and be the music supervisor for 187. And it was great because he read the script and we sat down and talked. And I had one song that I said, okay, this is kind of the prototype for the sound that I want for the music. It was by Massive Attack,
Mhm.
the group Massive Attack. And I
Yeah,
said,
I know.
this is what I want. And Kris says, okay. So he started sending me tapes with music selections. And they weren't necessarily for specific scenes. They were just what
In
he
the same
felt
mood, the
reading the
mood.
script, what inspired him. And he sent them.
Yeah.
And I would listen to him and go, wow, that's interesting. And some of them, I just selected them and started designing the scenes to. And some of them we didn't discover until post. We took these pieces that Kris had selected and started cutting the scenes to them and went, wow, this works. The sort of the seminal piece really in 187 is the opening scene where Sam
Uh,
Jackson's riding across the Brooklyn Bridge
yeah.
um, by this group called Galliano. It's called Slack Hands. That whole scene, shot for shot, is designed to that piece of music from the opening until he ends up in the classroom on the bicycle.
Wow.
That piece of music drove that scene,
That's insane.
and
You wrote it.
that's how I approached a number of different scenes in the movie. But it's the music. The music really, I think, has a real big effect on that film, and that came from Kris Doritas.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring you're just hammering this concept here of music because music is emotional and an emotional medium and film as well is. So it just makes so much sense that one would write with the song in mind a scene for a movie because we have an emotional response to films just as we
Right,
have to movies.
right.
So they're not like exclusive. It's the opposite. It's very much like connected to each other. So,
And
but
again, if you
we-
you can take a scene, with a piece of music that's iconic that you really like and know, and then put a different piece of music in
no,
and
it's
watch that.
all no, it's a whole different deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just no, it just doesn't make sense.
Oh,
But we'll get to 187 in the second
okay. Yeah.
session.
All
Now,
right.
I wanted to ask you about casting on Fandango. Okay, you mentioned Kevin being coming in to read again, and this time you cast him as Gardner. But the casting of the other characters, how did that happened? I mean, how did you pick Judd Nelson? How did you pick Sam Roberts? How did you pick Chuck Bush,
Yeah. Uh,
mutual friend?
the casting on Fandango was interesting. I had this great casting director, Mary Goldberg, who's no longer with us. Mary was great. And I went to New York actually, did a lot of casting there and saw a lot of young actors, you know. Some I cast, some I didn't. I'll never forget, like um, Patrick Swayze came in and, you know, a lot of different people.
Well,
But I ended up casting the people that were in it, uh, Judd and Kevin and Sam and all, because their personas fit the characters I had written the best for
okay.
me. And that's why I chose them. You know the story of Dorman, how he got selected, and that was just we needed
Wow.
a big guy. We needed a big guy.
Guy.
He's a man of few words. So um, yeah, we were literally 2 or 3 days away from shooting and still didn't have Dorman cast. And my assistant at the time, Mark Ilsley, and I were at a 7-Eleven in Austin, and we're sitting there in the parking lot. And all of a sudden, this big guy gets out of a car and walks inside. And Mark and I looked at each other and said, "Go talk to him." So Mark goes up and approaches him. And of course, this guy's like, "Whoa, what is this?" Somebody's saying, "Wait, you want to come talk about being in a movie?" At first, he was like, "I don't believe this. This isn't
Yeah.
real." And literally, that's how he ended up in the movie. Just we saw him in a parking lot at 7-Eleven.
Um, so you have so Fandango comes out, it does nothing in the US, but in Europe, almost a year later, like January 85, it comes out in the US, and in September it's brought to Italy at the Venice Film Festival where it gets a tremendous response from the audience and the critics and stuff. But that must have been like somehow some kind of vindication for you that the Europeans liked it more, responded to it
It
more than.
was, and I mean, no, it was great. You know, that I was finally like, wow, somebody finally gets it. Somebody understands what I was trying to do, appreciates it. And I guess to some extent, ever since then, and even today, I kind of feel more simpatico, more in tune with a European sensibility, filmmaking wise, than an American sensibility. I still
Okay.
feel that. I prefer working in Europe to working in the US. It's
Well,
just a more dy it's just a more dynamic way to work. You know, you have all these people from different countries and they all have their own abilities and sensibilities and it's mad, but it works. It works. In the US, it's more like a machine. You know,
okay, yeah.
they've got their job, boom, 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 boom. But in Europe, it's I don't know. I prefer working in Europe.
There's more of an artistry going on still
Yeah,
than the
yeah,
machinery, right? Okay. So
yeah.
now that you have Fandango, it's your first feature. It's done, completed. Do you have like what do you have a do you have a total vision of what your career would be like from a bird's eye view? Or
I I did, you know, I had things that I wanted to do. I mean, I'd written the script that became Red Dawn that
yeah,
I wanted to direct, but
which
they
was
didn't
more
feel like
like
I had enough experience. That's another story. You know, John Milius ended up doing it,
yeah,
and that was kind of
transformed it. It's
refreshing.
just yeah, it's just so
Transformed it. That was not a great experience. But, you know, I got another movie made. I was writing another script that most people have never seen before. It's called Little Things. It's something I really, really wanted to do.
so in
Um,
the intervening years between Fandango and the Beast, you're writing stuff.
yeah.
And what are some of those? So Little Things is one.
Yeah, it's a project called Little Things, and it's actually I really like it a lot. I feel like the first half of it is some of the best stuff I've ever written, but I never could solve the second half of it. I couldn't solve it in a satisfactory way. It
Okay.
didn't work well, and so it never got made. And I'll never forget, you know, at the time I was still with Amblin, and I'd written like the first half, and I gave it to Kathy Kennedy, and unbeknownst to me, uh, one day I get this phone call and it's Harrison Ford,
Wow.
and he'd read it. He'd read this first half, And he goes, "Where's the rest of it?" And I said, "Well, I haven't finished it yet." And he goes, "Really?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he goes, "Well, finish it." And because he liked it, and he would have been perfect as the character. But I could never lick it. I could never solve the second half of the script. The first half is great, the second half is not so great. And it's a shame because I think it could have been a really cool movie.
But is it a drama? Is it
Yeah,
sci-fi?
it's a drama.
It's a drama, okay.
Yeah.
I don't mean to spoil it. I'm curious, you know.
No, it was written in the 80s during the drug heyday, and it was about this guy who he was like a burned out DEA agent, and he's sent down to South America to find out this particular source of where all these drugs are coming from is deep in the jungle. And he's sent down there, and he's a total burnout case. He was going to do one more mission and he's going to quit because he's had it.
Yeah.
And that's what he's on, is this last mission. And it's what happens to him when he goes down there.
Well, finish it.
Yeah, today it probably feels too dated, but
Well, the
if you want, I'll send it to you. You can read what I did, and you can see what I'm talking
well,
about.
I'd love to read it.
All right,
See if
remind me,
I
and I'll send it to you.
see if I feel any differently than Ford does.
Okay.
No, just kidding. So, I guess your involvement with Amazing Stories was because of
Right.
your rapport with Stephen Amblin and Kathy Kennedy, right? How did that come about? Was that a good experience for you?
Yeah, they were doing the Amazing Story series, and so they invited me to come in and do one of them.
Yeah,
Um,
episode.
and the only thing that was interesting about that one was, I don't know if you've ever seen that particular episode
I
that I
have.
okay. I wanted to change the
You look
ending.
disappointed.
Well, no, I wanted to change the ending of it because
Okay.
I wanted to do more like Twilight Zone, which always had these really kind of dark, ironic endings.
Hmm.
Then in the short that I did, and the Amazing Story, the guy manages to save everybody by preventing this big plane crash.
Yeah.
And the way I did it was, when he goes out there to try to prevent it, he accidentally ends up causing the plane crash in his
Wow.
dream.
That's dark.
Yeah.
That's
He
dark.
goes out there. If you've seen it, you'd understand. It could easily go one way or the other. But
Yeah.
instead of
I
preventing it, he
remember.
causes it. And I thought, oh, that's more ironic. But they didn't like that.
Yeah, that was never gonna fly with Steven
So,
and Hamblin.
no,
So your second feature, The Beast,
right.
the stage play.
Yeah,
Uh, it's about a bunch of Soviet soldiers, a bunch of young guys, much like Fandango, which has the Vietnam War looming in the background.
right.
But and while The Beast is about these Soviet soldiers who are smack in the middle of their own Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan in the 80s. So there's a thorough line here between the two movies, if you will. And so how did the project find its way to you? I mean, with it being a stage play, how did you seek it out? How did
The
that
first
happen?
the first thing I got was, I mean, at the time, I was represented by the William Morris Agency, and
Uh,
one of the readers there, a guy named Dave Patrizzi, he sent me this like 50-page outline that apparently Bill Simone had done. It wasn't a play; it was an outline. And I went, "Whoa, what is this?" And they said, "Yeah, it's a play called Nanawatai. You should go see it." So it was playing in LA, and I went to see the play. And, you had all these guys on stage and this device. It's like this semi-transparent tank,
yeah.
and they're acting it out on stage. And at the end, I went, "Hey, this isn't a play. This is a movie." And, I met with Bill Simone. And at the time, this guy named Dale Pollock at A&M Films, was approaching me and about trying to do something. He was an executive at A&M Films. So Dale um, got Bill and I together and paid for Bill to do an adaptation of Nanawatai into a screenplay, which was called The Beast. And that was also my first introduction to Seattle because Bill was working here in Seattle at the time at a theater. And I flew up and I spent a couple of weeks working with Bill on the screenplay. We had a great time working on the screenplay together, and we're very happy with it. Finished the screenplay. Dale liked it. And so we were like, okay, well, where do we take this? And at the time, Columbia, David Putnam, the English producer who
Yeah.
did Chariots of Fire and all these other movies, he had just taken over at Columbia. And, you know, he was sort of more of a filmmaker's executive. So we took it to Putnam and gave him the script. And he said, well, how much do you think it'll cost? And said, it'll probably cost between $9 and $11 million. This is the 80s.
Yeah.
And he goes, okay, I'll read it. Literally the next week he calls back and he says, I like this. I'll make it. I'll give you 6.5 million. And like,
Wow.
okay. So we started negotiating back and forth. And I think ultimately they ended up giving us 7.5 million to make it, but we set out to go do it.
You shot in Israel, right? How
We
was that?
shot in Israel. I went to Pakistan. Actually spent a couple of weeks in Pakistan scouting um, up on the Afghan border, which was crazy. Um,
Wow.
and this was like at the height of the war, and I was in. Um, Again, they let me do this. I was thinking about shooting in Pakistan, so I was up on the border in Peshawar, which is where all the refugees from Pakistan, I mean from Afghanistan, were coming in,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was just chaos. It was like Casablanca in the 40s or something. All these refugees, and there were car bombings every day and stuff. And the hotel I was staying in, you could tell there were like intelligence people all over the place watching everybody. And it was really strange. But after a couple of weeks of that, I realized this is crazy. There's no way we could shoot here. We couldn't get insured. The bond company wouldn't give
Yeah.
us a bond. So then we went to Israel. And the thing in Israel that really nailed it and why we ended up going to Israel was the fact that they had these Soviet tanks they'd captured from the Syrians in the 1973 war.
Yeah.
And they were going to let us use them because
Wow.
we needed tanks for the movie. So, okay, we've got Soviet tanks. We've got a terrain that looks something like Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's
I
similar.
guess it's going to
Yeah.
be Israel.
Yeah.
So that's how we ended up there.
And it's a very, I think, one of the most poetic war movies I've ever seen.
Well, thank you.
It's like it's more like Thin Red Line than it is Private Ryan, just to bring, something up that just to make you understand how I see it. Um, but how did you, I mean, the casting here, Jason Patrick, how did that happen? Or the casting for this movie? Why did you
Well,
pick these guys?
I'll tell you about that in a second. But first, I'll just say, at the time when I was trying to make The Beast, I was heavily influenced by the movie Platoon,
Yeah,
Oliver Stone's Platoon.
yeah,
Yeah, it just come out, and it felt so authentic and so
yeah,
real. And I think there's a certain poetry in that movie
yeah,
too.
yeah,
And I found out that the guy, when I read about that all the actors had been through this military training, and
yeah,
the guy that had put him through this training was Dale Dye.
yeah,
And so it was my intent. And I told Dale Pollock, I said, look, if we do this, I want to get this guy to come and work with us. So we cast the movie, and again, it was just a process of Eileen Starger was our casting director, and she was great and saw a bunch of different actors. And in the end, I just chose the people that felt closest to the characters. Um,
and
uh,
George,
George Zunza,
Jones,
George Zunza,
he's slimmed down for the role.
he lost 100 pounds to play
Yeah,
that role. George is a
he's
pretty heavy guy.
yeah, pretty heavy guy, and he's so good in this movie.
He was very good, but he did. He lost 100 pounds to
Yeah,
play 𝙁𝙁. And I think as soon as we wrapped, he immediately started putting it back on.
uh,
But
but
yeah, that was a very physical movie. Extreme.
How long did you shoot that for?
We shot for at least 12, 14 weeks. And we were down in the Negev desert. by the Dead Sea and down in Eilat, which is down north of the Gulf of Aqaba. We're all over the place. It was a very difficult picture.
Yeah.
Uh, but one of the things again that made it work was, Dale came on, and Dale throws himself into, he was a Marine, so it was
Yeah.
easy for him in platoon to teach other Marines, but he had to learn. He already knew to some extent, but he really had to immerse himself in Soviet tactics and Soviet warfare and Soviet equipment and all. And he brought an assistant with him, and the actors. We show up in Israel, and we rehearse for, I don't know, maybe a week, just rehearsing. And then I turned them over to Dale. He took them out in the desert, and they lived out in the desert for like 10 days in tents.
Wow.
And he would wake them up at 2 o'clock in the morning and take them on maneuvers and stuff. And when I finally came back after 10 days, I went out in the desert where they were living. They hadn't had a shower, they hadn't had anything for 10.
They look like refugees.
They did. And he had them all lined up at attention. And
Right.
they were terrified of Dale because he ran it like a boot camp.
Yeah.
But he ran them through their paces, and I watched them, and they could run a tank. They could field strip an AK-47 blindfolded in 30 seconds and put it back
Wow.
together.
Wow.
And they knew every position inside the tank. The guy who was the loader knew how to load the cannon. The character, the Jason Patrick character, he knew how to drive the tank. And so what it did was, because they knew all that, it became second nature to them. So when we were shooting the movie, it wasn't awkward. They knew exactly how to do everything, and it looked real because they did know how to do it.
Yeah, second nature.
Second nature. It was complete second nature, and it made a huge difference, I
Yeah.
think, in the authenticity of things.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes through watching the movie. You feel like these guys are not acting.
Right,
They're tank driver, they're whatever, but
right,
real. I mean, they come across as real.
right.
Um, so I think it's a terrific movie. I urge everyone out there who's gonna be watching this to check this out, seek this movie out. It's called The Beast. In some countries, it's known as The Beast of War,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah.
it's just a terrific motion picture. So The Beast doesn't do well.
Nope.
So now this is your second movie not doing
It
well.
didn't do well. No.
How do you navigate these disappointments? I mean, in terms of not artistically, maybe, because maybe you did what you set out to do, you accomplished what you set out to do, but and you're not in the business of making films to make money, but you want the film that you do to be seen by as many people as possible. So how did you and how do you navigate these disappointments, if you will? Like people are not responding, so to say, to what I'm putting out. So personally, how do you deal with that?
It's difficult. It's really difficult because, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, your films have to succeed in order for you to get a chance to make another one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was very disappointing that The Beast, got no audience. It was a product of the fact that just as the movie was finishing, David Putnam, who'd only been there at the studio for like a year and a half, he was fired,
Oh, a
and
change of
they got rid of him, and a new regime came in.
yeah,
And typically, when a new regime at a studio comes in, they don't want anything to do with the previous regime's movies, and so they kind of dump them.
yeah.
And that's what happened to The Beast. We got dumped. Very little distribution. In retrospect now, kind of like Fandango, it's a movie I'm very proud of. It's one of my favorite films that I've done, but it didn't do any business
And
whatsoever, which, yeah, proved it makes things more difficult for you in trying to make another one.
but
Definitely.
do you feel it was also I mean, the movie again, I can't stress this enough, is just terrific. Check it out, seek it out because it's just great. But do you feel like it underperforming was due to the fact that this was the 80s? This was all about a
It
different
was
set
about Russians in Afghanistan.
a
And
different sensitivity. People,
correct,
Rambo and all the action guys and all
correct.
that. It was not in tune with what maybe the general public, the popcorn munching audience wanted.
I think that's very accurate. I think that's
Okay.
to a large extent, that's exactly what happened. The
I
public
mean,
was
this
like,
was a movie out of the 70s, maybe.
yeah, I mean, the audience was like, wait a minute, the Russians are our enemies. Why don't we want to go see a movie where the Russians are sympathetic, you
Exactly.
know?
Yeah.
So people people weren't that interested in it. I'll never forget the first time when we tested the movie. And you've been editing for months, so you're desensitized to it. And the first time we tested the movie, that there's an opening scene, when the village is destroyed and they take the guy and throw him under the tank, and he won't tell them what they want, so they run over him with a tank. And it's a fairly intense scene. The first time we screened the movie, when that scene was over, probably 2 dozen people got up and walked out. It was too intense for them. They were like, I can't watch this.
And
So I
so,
actually had to tone that scene down a little bit
yeah,
for an audience because it was too intense. And again, as a filmmaker, you cut it back and forth, you see the shots. It doesn't have the same effect on you,
yeah,
anymore as
because
it does
yeah,
on the audience the first time they see it.
yeah.
And that was a real lesson to me in that regard.
But also maybe it has to do with Americans not just what you were trying to do when you were writing Red Dawn. Americans never had a war fought in their own backyard. While
Right.
while Europeans, we know what it's like having guerrilla warfare going on in our own backyard. So these
Right.
scenes right out of the beast, we are used to that, to seeing them next to
Correct.
us happening. But Americans maybe just they live in fantasy land maybe when it comes to that. And
They
so
do.
it's too far-fetched or extreme for them because in their psyche they're not used to having that happen so close to them. So when they see it, they just can't take it. Maybe that,
Yeah. It's too alien to them. They're kind of like mentally, they're like, oh, this couldn't happen. I don't believe this. And one of the problems with the Beast was it was a conscious choice on my part. I cast American actors and I had them speak with American accents.
uh-huh,
And a lot of people complained about that. And at first it threw people. They're like, wait a minute, these are Russian soldiers and they sound like Americans. But
yeah,
I did that on purpose because after the first few scenes, you forget that. And
yeah,
what it does is for an American audience, it makes you relate to the characters
yeah,
because they sound like you. And that's
yeah,
what I wanted him to do. I wanted him to relate to these people and
yes,
realize they're just people like you are, you
yeah.
know. And that was the whole idea behind that.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why you're a director. I'm not.
I don't know.
So between the Beast and your next project, there's 3 years,
Yeah.
98, 91. What are you doing in those years? Are you
Writing,
writing,
trying to
you're
get
writing,
trying to get another project off the ground,
and uh,
Sometimes they come close, sometimes they fail.
okay, but are you still writing on little things, or are you writing something else here now in between
I was writing on,
88?
I was still writing on little things at the
Okay,
time, trying
and
to make
where
it work.
coming off of your experience on Fandango, were you and Kevin trying to do other projects together in those years?
Yeah, yeah, we were talking and um,
What genres were you like trying to work with him on? Like,
there was actually, well, there were two things that he asked me to get involved with that, I probably shouldn't have, it. I turned down. What's the one? It's called Finish with Engines. What's the one where he
No Way
plays
Out.
No Way
It
Out?
became No Way Out. Yeah.
Yeah, became No Way Out, and so they asked me to get involved with that. I just didn't respond to it like he did, and
Hmm.
so I didn't. And the other one he actually asked me to get involved with was Dances with Wolves. He originally asked me to direct it, and
Really?
again, I didn't respond to it the way he did, and obviously, he did it and did a great job.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were other projects during that. There was another project, with Harrison Ford that never came to fruition either. And so yeah, I spent 3 years in the wilderness, if you will, before ultimately, after
But
being on and off a couple of different things, ended up with Robin Hood.
Robin Hood. But before Robin Hood in '89, Kevin called you up to help out with dances with
Right.
moves out in South Dakota, right?
Mhm.
You helped shoot the buffalo sequence, if I'm not mistaken. So
Right.
that must have been a gigantic undertaking because I don't know how many buffalo was out there. I mean, 300 buffalo.
I
Uh,
think that herd was about 500 buffalo, as I
500
recall.
buffalo, and it hadn't been it hadn't been done like that ever. So how was that like?
Sure, you just froze. Can you hear me? There you go. You're
Yeah,
back.
I can. Yeah, how was that? How was that like shooting that
It was challenging. I'd never worked with buffalo before, and
or since?
I mean, we could do a whole show just on that. It was just, buffalo are not like cattle. People think, you can herd them like cattle. You can't because they're more like wild animals. They're more like wildebeest or antelope or something. They're much more skittish than cattle are. So it's harder to control them. And um, I tried to go out there and help Kevin design the sequence and did storyboards for things. And I shot some of the stuff. And um, I don't know, I was out there for, I don't know, a few weeks or 2 or 3 weeks. And it was interesting. It was an experience. I was just trying to help him because,
Yeah,
he was making his movie. And,
yeah,
some people said there were rumors back in Hollywood that, oh, Reynolds is directing the movie and stuff. Well, it just wasn't true. I wasn't. It was his movie.
yeah, yeah.
It was his movie.
So your very next feature, then your actual feature is Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves.
Yeah.
And how did the project find its way to you? I mean, was this a subject you were always interested in tackling, or as a storyteller, you always dreamt of eventually doing your Robin Hood story? Uh,
No, no,
how
I'll
did
tell
it?
you how I got there. Well, like I said, for a few years, I'd been on and off different projects. None of them got made. And I'd actually been on another film that was going to shoot in Australia, a little script I really, really liked with a producer I liked. And then just before I was about to get on the plane to go to Australia, one of the execs at Universal said, "Let me have lunch with me." And they said, "We want you to stay here and do this film called Day Before Midnight." And I was like, "I'm about to get on a plane." I said, uh, you know, they said, "Yeah, I know, but stay here, do this. We're making this movie." And so I read the script and I said, "This is a $40 million movie." But back then, this was like 1990. That was a lot of money for a movie. It's $40 million. Today
Yeah.
it's a lot of money, but back then it was a lot of money. And they said, "No, it's not 40 million." I said, "Yes, it is. It's a very expensive movie. It's gonna be $40 million." They said, "It's not, but we're making this." So anyway, long story short, they convinced me to bail on the movie I was going to go to Australia for, which, in some ways I should not have done, but it had good consequences in other ways I'll tell you about later. Uh, but I jumped suddenly onto this Universal picture, was casting and went to New York. I was looking at rewrites and stuff, and we spent, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 months prepping this movie. And it was a good story, really good story. It was
Was
actually written
shot.
by,
Was that a drama? Was that?
yeah, it was written by a couple of friends of mine. They became friends after that. Very good story. But ultimately, like we got about 3 months into it, and I'm casting and stuff like that. And the initial budget came back for the picture. It was $39 million. The studio goes, "We're not spending that." And I was like, "I told you it was going to be $40 million. They said, "Yeah, but we're not going to spend that." I was furious because they wanted to like cut the, so we're not going to spend more than 30 and all this stuff. And there was no way you could do it for 30 million. And I was really pissed off. And literally the next week, I don't know how he got wind of it. This guy named Jim Robinson,
Yeah.
who he sent me this script for Robin Hood. And they go,
But there
"We'll
were
make,"
other, right? There were other Robin Hood projects being
which I
developed
didn't
at the
know
time,
about,
which
which
you
I
didn't
didn't
know
know
about.
about. But they sent me this script and they said, "We will make you pay or play. We're making this movie." come do it. I was so fed up. I said,
I'll do it.
hell with it. Yes, okay, I'll make this one. You're making it, fine. I'm tired of this.
Yeah.
And so I jumped off of that movie and I went on the Robin Hood movie. I didn't think it was a great script, but it was like,
Didn't?
okay, no. I said, but I'll do it. And literally, I move over to these new production offices, and it was like I probably went over there on a Thursday or Friday, and literally the following Monday, I get a phone call from Costner, and he goes, "Can I come see you?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, come on over." So he comes over to the office where I am, and he comes in. He goes, "You're doing this Robin Hood movie?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, did you know that I was going to do this Robin Hood movie with John McTiernan?" And I
Mm-hmm.
said, "No." I said, "Nobody told me that." He goes, "Yeah." He said, "I was going to do Robin Hood with John McTiernan." I'm like, "Oh, crap." I said, "I'm sorry, man. If I'd known, I wouldn't have taken this, but I've already signed on. The deal's done." And he was like, oh. Anyway, what had happened was John Robinson knew that Costner was about to take this movie. And so
Uh-huh.
what he did was he hired me to do this other Robin Hood, hoping
Did
that
he
Costner would bail on that
fail
movie and
on
come
the other?
to this one,
Okay.
which he did. So it worked.
It did. But wow, it's quite a story. Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder, this is such, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's a classic, man. It's just beloved. It's the definitive version of the story. Whether you like it or not, it is. Believe
There are
me.
things about it. There are things about it that I like a lot that I'm very proud of, and there are things about it that make me cringe.
So,
But
so actually, what sealed the deal for you on Prince of Thieves was actually you being fed with everything else that was going on, and and after being offered the movie, you went, okay, I'll do it because I'm so fed up with the rest of it that
that's right. That's
okay,
right.
so
That's really the reason why I did it, because this is a movie that's gonna finally get made.
get made,
No ifs, ands, or buts. They're making a firm deal with me. It's gonna get made. That's why I ended up doing it. I knew
okay,
we were gonna have to do some work on the script. And once I came on and I started working on the script, I don't know where it came from, but this character, the sheriff, it started to develop in my mind, and he became outrageous.
yeah.
They started writing his dialogue. He just started becoming outrageous. And
So it wasn't that in the original script.
no,
It was much more mellow. It was
he
like
was much more of an arch kind of villain, kind of
yeah,
traditional villain. There was not any humor to it.
okay,
And I don't know. He just kind of, as I sat down to write him, that's how the scenes came out. And then Alan came on, and Alan loved that. Alan really responded to that. He enjoyed that unusual outrageousness of the character, and he fed on it, and he added to it. And that was the most fun aspect of that movie for me was creating the sheriff with Alan.
and what about the music? I mean, the music is such a huge component of this film.
Right.
This film's identity. And the score by Michael Kamen is just out of this world. Um, did you pick Kamen, or were you the
He
one
was suggested to me, and I was so overwhelmed with everything else at
with
the
everything?
time. I didn't really have time to like look at other composers, and we were kind of out of time. So
Yeah.
he was suggested, and I said, okay, sure, fine. Michael Kamen.
Did you guys work together, or did you let him do his thing and just would check in with him every now and then, or
Yeah, it was more that. And I still remember the first time I went over to his place and sat down with him, and he just had a keyboard. And he said, I'm just going to play this theme for you. And he just played very simple, the theme on this keyboard.
yeah,
Nothing lush, nothing big and orchestral. It was just this little theme on the keyboard. And yeah, that's nice. That's great. Then, of
yeah,
course, he turned it into, something bigger.
yeah.
And, uh, and Brian Adams did the theme song. And, you know,
That was huge.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, how so the success of that? Oh, the other question I wanted to ask you about was Sean Connery's involvement.
Yeah.
How did that come about? Was it Kevin who made the call because they'd worked on Untouchables, or what was it?
I don't remember if he made the call or not. I knew that they wanted to have they wanted Connery because they felt like that would be, just another punch
Yeah,
to have him play this cameo as the king. And I thought, well, that'd be great if we could get Sean Connery to play. He's in one scene,
yeah.
but if you
He's
could
so
get him to do it.
powerful.
So I can't remember if Kevin contacted him or what, but anyway, he agreed to do it, and I think he was paid $1 million for one day's work.
Yeah.
Um, and he came out to the set before we shot the scene. I met him and we talked, and it was interesting. He was even though he's only going to be there for a day, we talked and he had questions about the character and stuff. But on the day when we shot it, I'll never forget. He was not tense, but he was very focused on what he wanted to do. But when the camera turned over, as soon as you called action, he became Sean Connery. But he knew what his screen presence was, and he knew what it had to be, and he knew how to be Sean Connery. And you watched him turn it on. It was very easy the way he did it, but it was just he knew what that presence had to be.
Wow.
And that was fascinating to watch an old pro do that. And then when we cut the scene together, I intentionally played it so that, Marion calls out his name, Richard, and you don't see his face until he gets off the horse.
Yeah.
And that's the first time you see it's Connery. Well, when we did the first test screening and that shot came up where he steps off the horse and you realize it's Connery, the audience went crazy.
Wow.
They went crazy. And
Amazing.
we couldn't believe it. The response to the fact that he was in the movie. And it had a big impact on the film, his
Yeah.
being in it, because it was like the perfect tag at the very end of the movie. It made people go out of the movie, feeling really good.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Perfect. Exactly. Perfect.
yeah, and it was interesting because we did, we after the screening, the test scores came in and stuff, and I'll never forget Terry Simmel, who was the head of the
The
co-head of the
Warriors.
Warners. He turns to him and he goes, "This is what a hit looks like."
Well, he was
Uh, well,
right.
he knew right there that that's what they had.
Yeah. So
Um,
how do you feel about test screenings in general?
I think they can be useful. I think, I understand the necessity for them, especially in a big studio picture, because you've got tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars involved.
Yeah, lots of stake,
And
lots at
you
stake.
can you can learn things from because again, as a filmmaker, you get so deep in the weeds with the movie. You know the material backwards and forwards. You cut it and you've seen so many times, you lose perspective. So
Hmm.
you can't be objective about the film anymore at that point.
Yeah.
You need an audience that has never seen it before to give you an honest reaction to it. And sometimes you don't like that what their reaction is. Sometimes a scene that you love, they may hate, and sometimes a scene that you don't think works at all, it doesn't mean anything to you, they love. It's very interesting to see how an audience responds to it.
Yeah.
So, especially in a studio picture, you have a certain obligation to respond to that audience reaction and try to tailor the film to make it more appealing to an audience. If it's
But
if it's a smaller film, if it's a more personal film,
mhm.
sometimes the audience reaction it's more sort of a subjective thing. Maybe they don't like a character, and maybe they're not supposed to like the character, but they'll say, "Oh, I didn't like the scene because of this character," and you're like, "Well, you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to like the character."
Yeah,
But sometimes the producers will look at that and go, "Oh, we got to change that because they don't like
yeah,
the character." You're like, "They're not supposed to,"
yeah.
you know.
But yeah, I mean, but sometimes audiences, as you were saying, they just want things taken out because they make them feel uncomfortable.
Right,
But they're useful. They're integral part of the story. Just I don't know, maybe people didn't want the wolf to be shot in dances with wolves because it made
right,
them uncomfortable. But
right.
they had taken that out, the movie would have lost a poignant moment that was important in the story. So
Absolutely.
I don't think that test screening are necessarily, I mean, they can be looked at as, okay, we'll go through it, but I will still, as a filmmaker, make the decision at the end of the day.
I think that's the best way to approach it. I think you look at that and you get some objective information from an audience.
Yes.
And you can look at it and go, okay, well, that's valid. I feel like we need to work on that. We need to change that. But other things, I think you can say, you know what, that's going to make it a different movie. I don't want to
Yeah.
change that.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and so it's a combination of things. I think there's a legitimate
Okay.
reason to have test screenings to get an audience reaction when you can't be objective anymore. But I don't think that you have to change. I don't think you have to change your movie to reflect every single note that an
Um,
audience gives you.
yeah, no. So what was I mean, Prince of Thieves was a giant hit, but what was so difficult for you on the movie? I mean, the timing, the scheduling was,
You know, it was just a big production, and we jumped into it quickly because they wanted to go right away.
yeah.
You know, I think I came onto the picture in June, and I think we started shooting in September.
So this was June
So
1990, and you start shooting
yeah,
Denver
yeah,
1990. Okay.
yeah. And so, you know, I had to quickly go to England and start scouting locations. And, you know, I brought the cinematographer who shot The Beast, Doug Milsom. He came back to do it. And, you know, I'm casting, trying to do all these things, rewrite the script,
Yeah.
trying to do all that at the same time. Plus, it was the biggest movie I had done. And so, anytime, I think our budget on that was maybe $55 million. But anytime you spend a lot of money, you have a lot more pressures. You have more
Yeah.
people looking over your shoulder,
Yeah.
trying to say, "Oh, you should do this or you should do
But,
that," and that's just a function of the expense of a movie. Um, and I also found this is my first lesson in this is that when you have a big show, you have to prepare set pieces, action pieces, and all. It's hard to change your mind on the day sometimes. When you have to plan things ahead of time, you can't be as organic because a
okay.
change is more expensive. If you suddenly said on the day, you know what, I don't want to shoot it this way. I'd rather shoot it this way. It could cost a couple $100,000 for you to make that decision.
Wow.
So sometimes you can't do that. You have to stick with what you'd originally planned just because it's prohibitively expensive
Yeah.
to change your mind, even if it's a better idea.
Yeah. So you're
Sometimes
stuck.
you're
You're
stuck.
stuck with a bad idea potentially, just because it would
Right.
cost you so much money to to shoot a better idea. Okay.
Correct.
So how
Correct. And that's
do you find yourself working better as an independent filmmaker, I guess, right?
Yes. I prefer smaller films. I
Smaller.
mean, the budget level I really like is like the 30 to $40 million picture.
Yeah.
To me,
Okay.
that's a much more comfortable budget level to work at. You have more freedom.
Yeah.
You know, you can kind of respond to the moment more easily. I mean, there's still pressures, you know, they're never easy, but
Yeah.
it's not like on these giant movies like Robin Hood or Waterworld or
Yeah.
anything.
Um, so after this difficult production, Prince of Thieves, you and Kevin team up again on Rapa Nui.
Yeah.
He was producer on that, if I'm not mistaken. And so what was it about Rapa Nui that, wanted you to make it? And or was it something that you brought to Kevin and said, "Hey, I'd like to do this. Let's do it together," or what was the process?
You know, the story was something I'd been intrigued by for a long time about what happened on Easter Island. And I felt like it was a microcosm for humanity as a whole. And right after Robin Hood, Kevin and I had a falling out everybody knows about in Robin Hood. And I actually went down to Easter Island with my agent and friend, Mike Simpson. We went down there alone to just explore Easter Island because I was intrigued by the idea. Um, and came back even more intrigued and thought, wow, this would be a cool project to do. And hired an English guy to do a first draft on the script. He did. Anyway, in the interim, while that was going on, read this other script called Waterworld, and you know the story behind that, and we can discuss that later. But um, Larry Gordon, who was the head of Fox at the time, he got Kevin and I back together because Kevin liked the script too, convinced us to try to work together again on Waterworld. And as part of that agreement, we were going to put Waterworld off because Kevin couldn't work on it right away. And I wanted to do Rapa Nui. So we agreed to put Waterworld off, agreed with Universal that we'd make it, and they paid a holding fee. But in the interim, uh, we were going to do Rapa Nui. And because I'd just done um, um, Robin Hood and it was
Yeah.
successful, um, Warner Brothers agreed to do it with Kevin producing, and they agreed to do most of the financing on Rapa Nui.
Hmm.
And so we set off on another crazy adventure
But
on the most remote inhabited island on the
yeah,
face of the planet.
how was your relationship working with him, you as director and him as a producer on Rapa Nui? Was it what was it like?
It was okay. I mean, he was off. He was working on Wyatt Earp at the time, or
Yeah.
uh, something else. I forget what. I don't know. Anyway, he was making his film, and I went down there and was just on my own making it. He came down and visited while we were shooting, um, but it was okay. It was okay. But then it was another film that did no business.
Yeah. So how do you feel like coming off of Robin Hood and this is this tremendously successful and you have
Mhm.
reservations about the final result, but it's so successful and then going into Rapa Nui that's so personal to you is something that you've been interested in for a long time and it does no business. So does it throw you off as a person, as a filmmaker? And does it make you go like, are my instincts all wrong about what is a good movie or whatever?
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. It makes you go, wow, do I know what I'm doing? Maybe I don't, because I'm making these things that other people don't respond to, or I'm not making it well, whatever. It's just not working. And
Because
uh,
Rapa Nui is
that,
not a bad movie to me.
well,
It's
it's
solid entertainment. It's as all your movies are very solid
well,
pictures.
thank you for saying that. That's to me, in some ways, it's maybe the most disappointing movie because I don't feel like I really achieved completely what I set out to do. It was an extremely difficult movie to make, and maybe the most difficult movie
But
I've ever.
in what way did you not achieve what you set out to do? What was it that you wanted to achieve and didn't achieve?
I don't feel like
I mean,
I
from a
just don't feel like
storytelling
I don't
perspective?
I don't feel like the story came off the page the way it should have. I don't think I realized the scenes. Some of it came off too goofy. I didn't have the poetry or the depth that I hoped that it would have.
Okay.
I don't feel like I was successful at that. And sometimes I want to blame the island itself because the island is the most haunted place I've ever been. And I feel like in some ways the island didn't want its story told. And it kind of thwarted us at every turn. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. I guess I want somebody to blame. But sometimes I felt that way. It was just an extremely difficult picture to make.
But and how do have you ever visited the movie in the years
I
since
can't
then?
watch. I
You
can't go
can't?
back. It's really hard for me to go back and watch my movies.
Okay.
I I know you've heard me say this, but when I was in film school and directors would come and they'd screen their films and stuff and then talk about them afterwards, they would never sit through the screening. They'd go have a drink or something, then they'd show up afterwards and talk about the movie because they were like, I can't watch my movies. And I never understood that. I was like, what?
And now
And
you
now
do.
I totally understand because you
Yeah.
can't watch your own stuff the way an audience does because you're seeing a scene, you're going, oh, I remember the day we shot that. I remember what went wrong there. And God, why did I do that way? Why didn't I cut this
Yeah.
differently? You cannot watch your movies objectively. It's too painful.
I don't know. I just I like it. I like Rapa Nui.
Well, thank you.
I like that it's you're stranded on this island. You feel like you're out there because you guys were out there shooting it. So that comes across. That comes off
Yeah.
well. And I think the casting also works. I mean the
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. That was very difficult. We had a mostly a non-professional cast. It was mostly Maoris that were brought in because they were Polynesian, and most of them had little or no acting experience. There were a few that were great, like Cliff Curtis. He
Hmm.
was excellent, and he's still working. Cliff's a great guy. I worked with him again on Risen.
Yeah.
Um, Esai Morales was great. Jason Scott Lee,
Yeah.
um, but it was an extremely physical movie. It was very difficult to do.
Okay. So this was my last question for this first part. We covered proof all the way through Rapa Nui.
Hmm.
So we're gonna do our next part session whenever you feel like it, Kevin. Hopefully, I've not bored you to death.
No,
I hope some of the
sometimes I
questions.
enjoy talking about it sometimes because it makes me remember things I've suppressed or tried to forget or have forgotten. And
Okay,
it's interesting to recall them sometimes. But no, I mean, thank you for being curious. Thanks for asking these questions. They're good questions. You clearly know your stuff.
thanks.
But whenever you're ready to do the next thing, let me know.